Hey everyone, this is Agile Narrative Episode 3. Today we'll be talking about how narratives relate to brands reaching global citizens and people who value experiences over possessions. We will also check in on how some companies have successfully developed and rolled out their narratives. I'm Vanessa Zucker, your host and Spark's marketing manager. As always, I'm joined by Toby Trevarthen, Chief Narrative Officer. How's it going, Toby?
Hi, I'm well. Thank you for having me.
And Tim Donovan, Executive Vice President and Narrative Strategist.
Hello. Glad to be here. Excited to talk about narrative today.
All right, everyone, get in on the conversation by tweeting us at SparkPR with your questions and comments. Toby, on March 23rd, you lent your narrative wisdom on a panel that was part of a series called Afar Conversations. Let me lay down a quick background. Afar magazine, which is a publication focused on experiential travel, hosts these conversations. This session, which took place in West Hollywood, was called Arms Wide Open, Engaging Today's Global Citizen. The other panelists in the discussion were Javier Arredondo, founder and president of Travesias Media, which claims to be Latin America's leaders in travel, luxury, lifestyle, and current events-related publishing, and Aza Ziegler, founder of Calle del Mar, which is a high-end women's surf-inspired clothing company. So how was it? Did you get the Hollywood star treatment?
It was awesome, and yeah, they did a very nice job. We had a very elegant sound room inside the New London Hotel right outside Sunset Strip. Very nicely done, and yeah, a little bit of Hollywood.
Did narrative fit right into this conversation? Because I was a little surprised that it was travel related.
Yeah, the thing that was kind of most exciting about this is to realize how transcendent narrative is with respect to category. And yeah, I was kind of interested by the blending of the people in the room. We had about 80 people or so from various walks of agency life, brands, and a lot of travel folks. And narrative kind of rose to the occasion quite nicely as it related to what's going on at the airports today with the Trump administration and what they're doing. And it was ironic that we had someone there from Mexico City. So we had kind of a juxtaposed view of traveling to America.
I saw that this panel discussed what it means to be a global citizen, how consumers value experiences over possessions, and emotional connections to experiences. This sounds like something that narrative would touch upon. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think Afar as a media company is really about the experience. So they really go to great lengths to help a person figure out where they want to go and give them kind of context that would allow them to explore. They also are doing something very cool with young folks who've never traveled before, never set foot on a plane before, and giving them an immersive experience in travel. And the context of the night was pretty much that, traveling around the world, builds empathy. It builds a deeper, wider knowledge of what really life is about other than reading it or watching it on television. That was primarily what got discussed, was the immersive elements that travel lends itself to. And it was an interesting juxtaposition on the panel where Aza is a 25-year-old millennial. So we got into like social media and how she promotes her brand and how she connects with global citizens, because while she's made here in the States, her biggest supporters are Australian, Japan, London, and I believe one other European city, I think Paris. So it was interesting to have her talk about the significance of Instagram and how that is building her business.
Oh, yeah.
And we got a little bit into YouTube, and she referred to that as people younger than her. That's their medium, not her medium. So it was really kind of interesting to already see like generational gaps between who uses what kind of social media.
I'll chime in too a little bit that I think travel is a great metaphor for narrative. Narrative, by its very nature, is about a shared experience, and it can come in different forms. In some ways it could be a shared experience related to culture or religion or belief in climate change. And so much like travel, where you're going on a journey, narrative is about the journey of many that are experiencing sort of the same emotional resonance to a topic or a subject. So it's really appropriate to have that conversation in the context of traveling. And one thing I would say is there are a lot more narratives coming to the forefront around the idea of global citizenship. Let us not forget, some of the earlier policies from the Trump administration around immigration. And it was very clear that people felt strongly on both sides related to that. There were narratives playing out about immigration to the United States and what that means and how that impacts, being a good American, so on and so forth. These are themes that really have an intense connection to people in different ways. Just going back to the global citizenship thing for a second, one of the things that I thought was interesting is that during the early days of the policy, there were brands that were reacting in different ways, and this is a good way to tie back brand to narrative. Lyft, for example, when the travel ban started to take place, very, very quickly donated $1 million to the ACLU. And so they were kind of in a very active, visible way pronouncing which side of that narrative they wanted to support.
And aren't they now letting their riders donate money for each fare that they pay?
They are, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, they just launched a new program that's going to be announced next week, I believe.
Yeah, and that ties into something that Toby and I talk a lot about, which is this concept of brand attunement. That brands need to be more aware of how they interact with the ecosystem around them, not just their customers, but beyond their customers, the community that they build their businesses in, things of that nature. So just going back really quick to that time frame with Lyft, conversely, we had Uber, who during some protests offered service at a surge rate price. And immediately there was a very negative reaction. And I think in part because people felt like the company wasn't being sensitive to a social issue that was happening in real time. And so Delete Uber, made itself known and had actually a pretty significant impact. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that today there are a lot of narratives around global citizenship and what that means. These narratives are activating people on both sides of the spectrum, and they are impacting businesses that are not sensitive to the ebb and flow of narrative and narrative impact. And this is why we think narrative is so...
Yeah, one of the things that came out in the discussion at AFAR was the whole notion of Mexicans traveling to the U.S. And Javier, his media company, is targeted really at the affluent Mexican population, and the narrative of Mexico, lends itself to these immigrants crossing the border, which, obviously the Trump administration is trying to block. But one of the significant findings that was discussed that evening was travel to the United States from Mexico has fallen by 35%. And it was effectively because they didn't want to deal with what would happen at the airport, being detained in some room. But the more important element was they didn't feel welcomed. That kind of played out throughout the night. So as we talked about America and its open arms and what it stands for in the global community, our current administration's approach is really putting a dour effect on people's desire to come here because they're not feeling very welcomed. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over time.
Yeah, didn't you share an article with everyone at Spark about how the U.S. needs to figure out its narrative in this day and age?
Yeah, it was an interesting piece that kind of went way back to the forefathers and all the way back to kind of the Puritans in terms of we had a certain sense of who we were as a country that was somewhat grounded in religious beliefs. Over time, that evolved somewhat into the American dream, which, I think was created somewhere in the 30s and has now kind of been tarnished. So it's almost like we need to rebalance or reset again to figure out who we want to be as a country.
One of the things that I think has become more interesting is what I would call narrative speed to impact. Before the advent of social media and the internet, narratives played out in a very organic way where people would get into discussions, meet in groups. That's where churches and mosques and temples all played a part in sort of being conduits of different forms.
Yeah,
of
even
narrative.
town halls,
yeah.
the local, dinery.
Village greens, I mean, you name it, where people were congregating. And, now fast forward, we live in a time of almost immediate information dissemination. And so I go back again to the Uber example, when sort of this kind of narrative of not being sensitive to social issues happened. The impact to Uber was lightning fast. I mean, it was just awe-inspiring. And I think it's important to sort of point out to our listeners that narrative can move very, very quickly these days, and good or bad. And so brands need to be very sensitive to that idea. And, it could be great in the respect that you have a brand that wants to launch a new narrative that's positive and has social value. It could take off just as quickly as a narrative that may be destructive. So it's sort of the genie's out of the bottle, I guess, these days, and it's been amplified by social media. And I think both Toby and I believe it'll only move that much faster.
Yeah, and to that point, as we dig deeper into cognitive sciences and consumer behavior, and we start to look at kind of some of the whys underneath narratives and what makes them evolve the way they do, the axiom of "it bleeds, it leads" goes back to the notion that anything negative tends to have a multiplier effect versus a positive context. So I think you go back to the reptilian brain, and we are born with a defensive mechanism. So ultimately, our antenna is much more attuned to Tim's comment about the negative aspects of something versus the positive aspects of something. And you always see that in a social context where somebody tweets out, "I had a bad experience," that thing explodes faster than I had a great experience. So there is definitely some of that we try to take account for as we build out narrative structures for people.
That's all over Yelp. For example, whenever I look up a business on Yelp, I just skip over all the 5-star reviews and only read the 1-star reviews.
And there was another article that came out a while back that we actually used in a presentation, and I brought it up at the AFAR conference. It was a gentleman by the name of Matt Locke out of London who wrote this article about schedule versus stream. And I thought that was a very interesting piece, in that we have grown up in a schedule world where, we had appointment viewing, appointment listening. Our day is scheduled. We work 9 to 5. We kind of have evolved that way for 100 years until Twitter came along. So over the last 10 years, we've introduced the concept of a stream. One of the two pieces that he really pointed out was schedule was a synchronization concept. It synced everybody together. We all watched the Super Bowl. We all watched I Love Lucy at the same time, and that then became water cooler effect, right, where you would talk about it the next day. But now that we have a stream, one of the things that's starting to happen is what he terms the decontextualization of the information, because you get it in bits and flow, and you lose context, right? And not to bring this back to a political place, but I think, what President Trump is doing with his Twitter account, exemplifies that, right? So now you have kind of this dichotomy of what was a scheduled life meets now this streaming life. And again, digital natives meets older generations. We're all trying to figure out how to play in this confluence of change.
Toby raises a great point around context. Narrative really requires context, in order to be authentic. And so, if we think about narrative as sort of this constant stream of consciousness and how it helps us define our belief systems. If we don't have context, we're getting information that may or may not be valid. And so we're now experiencing the whole phenomenon of fake news, which to me is information without context. So I challenge our listeners to think about how they inform their own personal belief systems, and are they seeing context that is associated with the information that they're digesting, they're reading, they're listening to. It's really, really important that you get a fair and unbiased wrapper of context so that you can make a real decision, whether that's personal or business related. And I think this era of fake news and just putting out statements without any proof, without any context can be very dangerous. There are a lot of people that just sort of take it at face value, and I think that's a scary thing to think about.
And I think that brings it full circle back to travel, right? Because they always say the best lessons when you travel is the education you get about learning about culture and other people, so that when you do get the news with a certain slant to it, you can register that against your own knowledge gained by being there. A lot of that came out, again, at the FR conversations.
I guess that means we should all go on vacation right now.
We
right?
should. Like the Australians, they get, 3 months off a year. I think we should practice that. I like that.
Is that to go surfing and wear Oz's outfits?
I think it's, cultural. Yeah, there you go. There you go. It gives them a reason.
All right, I'm going to move on to part 2. Tim, I'm going to call on you. Now that narrative has been a core part of this agency's philosophy for quite a while, what's working, and can you give us some examples of how companies are developing and executing on their narratives?
Sure, I'd be delighted. So it's been a very exciting and enlightening process. When we think about narrative in the context of business, I've lately been thinking about this idea of a Venn diagram. So sort of breaking narrative down into 3 components, or 3 smaller narratives. One is really the narrative of market value or market opportunity and business value. Because when we think about, communications, there are multiple audiences that we want to influence, and most certainly for our customers' sake is really business and financial media. So, how do we craft a narrative or align with an existing one that allows our clients to expand the perception of their business valuation? And that can happen through their technology and how they build their portfolio out. Second narrative is really about technology and helping our clients to define what we call white space. Is there a way to present what a client is doing from a technology standpoint that is new, interesting, innovative? I hesitate to say new category because I think people feel burned by that concept, but it's really about the expression of value in a differentiated way. And then the last one is really, how do we make a brand transcendent? And that really means, can we create a value proposition and an emotional resonance that allows the brand to have some relationship to people who aren't necessarily going to buy the product? Mm-hmm. And I'll give you an example of that. My mom is a big environmentalist, loves to go hiking, is a huge believer in renewable energy.
Oh, me too. So I am very enraptured by this one.
Okay, good. She has never seen a Tesla, right? And she lives on a farm in upstate New York in the Hudson Valley region, and lots of farmers around. I don't think any of them have a Tesla, but she's aware of the brand because of the focus of renewable energy and the possibility of having a clean future. And so in many ways, Tesla has become a transcendent brand. It's also transcended its market opportunity, or as Toby says, its total addressable marketplace, by moving from clean cars, electric cars, to other types of products that take on solar power in cities, transportation, space, right? So batteries. So it's transcended both in terms of how it relates and influences people as a brand, and then also it's transcended its product portfolio, starting from one place and expanding to more, and then also the valuation. I think actually, if it wasn't last month, Tesla has a higher market cap now than Toyota, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Wow.
If you think about Toyota being around for as many years as it has, and Tesla being around like an increment of that. Anyway, so tying it back to what we're experiencing here at Spark, I bring those sort of 3 circles of the Venn diagram up because different clients have used narrative for different reasons. For example, we have a workflow client that was challenged by not having a whole lot of news. And
a common problem.
A very common problem.
Yeah, one of the main problems.
And also in a very congested market category, with way bigger players. And so we met with the management team. Toby facilitated a fabulous design session. And the goal for that session was to do a couple things. One is to come up with new pattern language or nomenclature to express the value of the business in a differentiated way, to separate them from their competition. Second one was to define the future state of business and business networks. The CEO had really seen this convergence of software marketplaces where businesses would go online and buy and sell services, and that's really started to come to pass with the acquisition of LinkedIn by Microsoft, and we're seeing more and more services sold at the enterprise level through software marketplaces. And then the last goal was really the most important for them, which was they wanted to express their total market opportunity in a bigger way, their TAM. So we did some primary research looking at the services industry, which includes consultancies like Bain and Accenture and McKinsey, and then IT organizations that do a lot of implementation for enterprise. And the last one was agencies, and agencies could be the big holding companies like WPP, Publicis, or Omnicom.
Or people like us.
Or people like us,
Because
we're part of that.
saw ourselves in this.
And so we aggregated those three marketplaces together, and it came out to something like $3 trillion in sort of annual revenue and value. And so that gave this company a whole bunch of tools in their tool chest to start expressing their value in a differentiated way. Make a long story short, I think 8 to 9 months after we had our design session, they were able to close on a round of funding. It was like their Series B or C for $39 million, led by Goldman Sachs. And one of the big contributors to that round of funding and building investor confidence was the narrative of expressing their business and the larger market opportunities. So that's sort of one concrete example of how a business would use narrative. We have another company. It's an analytics company out of Canada, and they wanted a narrative as sort of the foundation for their brand expression. They're in the business of really disrupting the business intelligence market space, because it's become very complex, very expensive, hard to implement, hard to get information out of these monolithic systems. And so we did a design session. Toby facilitated that one as well. And the narrative of goodbye, hello started to manifest. And it was the idea of saying goodbye to BI and hello to opportunity, hello to getting the answers you want, hello to faster integrations.
And goodbye chaos, hello clarity. Yeah. It went on and on.
It became a mantra, and now that output of design has become their entire brand platform. And so we've had those two examples.
And they also raised $45 million just about a month back.
Yeah, thanks.
So we've seen two significant raises as a result of the output of the work.
And we've had one acquisition. Do you want to talk
one
about
acquisition, that? Yeah. So all in, last year we did 15 of these narrative executions. To Tim's comments, 2 have now raised almost $90 million. And then we had one exit in the ad tech space where a client was an innovator way ahead of its time. They were creating mobile programmatic audience targeting as a solution probably 5 years before everyone else. So you had a CTO who was a visionary, yet the brand and the what do we do now kind of isms had to kind of blend with this future state. So we crafted a very elegant narrative for them, and lo and behold, that helped them to achieve an exit.
We say narrative, but it's really strategy. At the highest level, it is a type of design strategy, and it's meant to bring services together. That's one thing, and the services could be content creation, programmatic distribution, measurement and insights, but it's a way to kind of glue those services together for a client. It's also designed to help the client differentiate itself in the marketplace and really help the executive team to be able to not join existing stories and conversations, but to introduce new ones, and then use that as a way to sort of frame the future state out. So I think sometimes when we talk to executives both in our client base and with other agencies, they get confused that narrative is nothing more than kind of a grandiose way to tell a story, right? But at the end of the day, what we're really trying to achieve is a very clear strategic focus that is co-created with our client that allows us to bring together in a very cohesive way all of our integrated services with the goal of creating or meeting or exceeding the KPIs that our client wants to have, and that could be funding, it could be an acquisition, it could be acquiring talent, engineering talent if you're in the talent war. It could be a distribution deal. The list goes on and on. If we think about it, story and narrative are the fundamental ways in which we communicate information. At the water cooler, at a family picnic, and of course through the media channels that we all turn to get our information.
And I think what we've uncovered as part of this process, because it's a never-ending learning curve, if you will, but I feel like we've established a through line for a company where both the internal culture as well as the external people that we're speaking to are in alignment. We just completed a narrative for a company that was a pioneer in what it did in the sharing space, and all of a sudden, 10 years later, sharing's just kind of already integrated. So what was their relevance today? So part of the challenge was how do we make this brand relevant again when it was a very known brand that we all used years ago, but kind of lost context because now it's embedded in almost everything you do. And I'm proud to say that with a lot of elbow grease and a lot of whiteboards, we got to a really good place, and their narrative is actually starting to roll out now. And in fact, just before coming in, I saw their corporate presentation, and they had really weaved it nicely in and throughout their product offerings. So it's kind of pleasing to see the outcome manifest into something.
Last thing I'll say is this is really for any listeners that are part of agencies. Many of the executives that I've spoken to over the past couple months have struggled with how to integrate their services. All of us are moving towards an integrated service model. Some big, some small, some in between. And even if a company acquires a design organization or a programmatic organization and insights and measurements, so on and so forth, they're still having a hard time trying to figure out how to knit the pieces together for the client's benefit. And so I think what Toby and I have discovered is this approach to narrative becomes the strategic meniscus that brings everything together. And so I think we feel like, maybe we're a little bit ahead of the curve on this. I think over time, more and more agencies will think about design thinking and the co-creation of narrative as the linchpin for bringing their services together and also producing value in a differentiated way.
Yeah, and I think, to add to that, I just actually read a report, I think last night, RBC put out an analysis. It was an interview with Scott Galloway, who's I think the founder of L2 Index, and he teaches at NYU, and quite the character in terms of his views on branding and marketing. And the primary note in that report was that businesses that are run by algorithms are winning. And he named 6 of them who, effectively are, eating the rest of the world. It goes back to Andreessen's software is eating the world. So if you don't have a narrative in place that, keeps you glued together, the forces of the market are definitely bearing down on a lot of companies out there.
And there you have it. Thanks for joining us, Toby and Tim, and sharing your insights. For all you listeners out there, how do you view the difference between Lyft's and Uber's narratives? How do you contextualize the news you read to make sure it's not fake? Have you built a successful narrative for your company, or do you have questions about how to do so? Let us know what you think by tweeting us at SparkPR, and we will see you on the next episode.
Block out and see the bottom line rise. Spark, we do it right. Shaping your story, transforming